Hi everyone, and welcome to the Clean Power Plan Planning Tool, or CP3T, webinar and walkthrough. I'm Pat Knight, the lead developer of CP3T, and today I'll be giving you an overview of the tool and a walkthrough on how to use it and how to use it for any type of scenario analysis that you might be interested in doing. Before we get into the walkthrough itself, I want to talk a little bit about webinar logistics. Just so everyone knows, we are recording the webinar today, and the recording will be made available after the webinar is over at synapse-energy.com/CP3T. If you have any questions as the webinar is going, please submit them through the comment form on GoToMeeting. If you think of any questions after the webinar is over, you can email them to cp3t@synapse-energy.com. Just note, we will not be responding to any questions during the webinar, but we will be responding to questions either individually through email, through a published FAQ, or with another webinar at a later date. So first, a little bit about our company. Synapse Energy Economics was founded in 1996. Synapse has been a leader for public interest and government clients in providing rigorous analysis of the electric power sector. And we've got a staff of about 30 people here who are experts in energy and environmental economics, and who specialize in applying that and environmental compliance to different projects. A little bit about myself. Again, I'm Pat Knight. I'm the lead developer of CP3T. My team and I have spent the past 4 months or so analyzing the proposed Clean Power Plan rule on behalf of more than a dozen clients. We've published numerous reports about the rule and presented these reports at over 5 conferences and have had discussions about the rule with dozens of entities, including consumer advocates, environmental advocates, state governments, other consulting groups, and private companies. Also, before 111D came out, I worked on creating and distributing the Coal Asset Valuation Tool, or CAVITY, and the Avoided Emissions and Generation Tool, which are 2 other Synapse tools that are available through the Synapse website if you're interested in learning more about those. So I'm sure a lot of people on this call today already have a good understanding of what the Clean Power Plan is. But I thought it would be helpful to pause here and talk a little bit about it, specifically the parts of it that relate directly to CP3T. So EPA issued a proposed Clean Power Plan in June 2014. The core of this plan involves setting emission rate limits for each state for the years 2020 through 2030. These emission rate limits are constructed using so-called building blocks, which each and of themselves reduce emissions for each state. These building blocks involve reducing emissions from coal heat rate improvements, or as a result of coal heat rate improvements, using natural gas combined cycle more in place of coal, counting generation from new and at-risk nuclear units, and counting future projections of renewable generation and energy efficiency. The Clean Power Plan Planning Tool, or CP3T, is a user-friendly, Excel-based spreadsheet tool based on the unit-specific data assembled by EPA to create their 111D building blocks. Within CP3T, you can adjust fossil unit capacity factors, renewable energy and energy efficiency projections, unit retirements, and non-111D, that is 111B, unit additions for each state. You can then compare the differences in your scenario in terms of generation, capacity, emissions, emission rates, and costs between one specific scenario and however many other scenarios you're interested in looking at, along with the EPA base cases. CP3T is released under a free open source model. That means that anyone can download a copy of the tool from the Synapse website at the link provided here and use it within the framework and caveats that Synapse provides. So here's a schematic of CP3T, and I think it's helpful to walk through this first in advance of the actual tool walkthrough, so everyone gets a kind of an outline in their head of where we're going in terms of the tool. When you first open CP3T, you encounter a launch page. On this page, you can name your scenario, but you can also do a couple of other helpful things. You can read the license agreement if you're interested in learning more about Creative Commons and how CP3T uses that. Or you can use the user manual. We spent a lot of time working on the user manual, and we think it's really important for most users to read the user manual before they dive into the tool itself. There's a lot of really helpful text in there about the methodology and background of the tool, as well as problems and caveats that you might run into. And we really think that using the user manual in conjunction with the tool will really help you make better scenarios. So after you've named your scenario and done all that stuff on the launch page, you can get into a page where you select your state. Once you select your state, you can, the model runs a little script where it populates the tool according to those state-specific variables. So it'll bring in information about renewables and energy efficiency and the units, the fossil units and nuclear units that go into those building blocks that we talked about. After picking your state, the next step is setting up preliminary inputs. Here, you can go through and make adjustments to your renewables. That means you can adjust the renewable gigawatt hours. You can adjust the characteristics. That is, how much should be wind, how much should be solar, et cetera. You can set up different capacity factors for different types of renewables. You can make changes to energy efficiency. You can adjust the energy efficiency savings, the costs. You can make changes to the projected load growth for your scenario. You can then make edits to non-111D generation, so that's new NGCs or NGGT capacity, and you can play around with the import and export assumptions. Finally, after that, you can make changes to the displacement order and the CO2 price. So once you set up the preliminary inputs, they all feed into the electric system model, and then spit you out on a page called Calibrate Scenario. And this is where you go through and check out whether you're meeting the requirements for 4 different variables across all of the years in your scenario. So those variables are peak demand, that's your state's required capacity to meet reliability purposes, generation, the 111D target rate, and the 111D target emissions. That's the mass-based target that was just released a couple of weeks ago. Now, many times, users will get to this Calibrate Scenario page and find that they're actually not meeting the requirements for each of these variables in all of the years. And that's to be expected. At this point, or at that point, users will begin to iterate. That means they can go back and make changes to their preliminary assumptions, or they can loop down to the state-specific unit data. That's where they can enter retirement years for certain units, or they can make changes to capacity factors, emission rates, or capacity. Once all this is done and the scenario is calibrated, or even before that if you were to so choose, you can go on and look at outputs. And these outputs come in 2 different flavors, tables and charts, and you can use these to compare against your other scenarios that you've been making and the EPA base case. So with that background, let's get into the tool itself. So this here is the splash page I was describing. Like I said, you can go ahead and read the user manual or the license and end use agreement. You can enter your scenario name. Let's just call this one test scenario. And then you can press this green button to begin analysis. There's a couple of other functions on this page I just want to highlight. The first is this skip directly to that calibrate your scenario step that I was describing. And that's helpful that if you've been working on a scenario and you close it out and you're coming back to it the next day, this just sort of leapfrogs all of the preliminary assumption steps and gets you to that core step that I was describing. Also, there's this button called Restore Default Excel Functionality. Now, this is built within Excel, but you might notice that there's a lot of things that you normally see in Excel along the edges of the screen missing. We've done that so the tool better holds your hand as you walk through all of these subsequent steps that we're about to go through today. But if you'd like to have that default functionality back, you can just push this button, and you can get all of your tabs and formula bar, etc. But for today, let's hide this and use the tool as it exists out of the box. So clicking Begin Analysis, we're next on a step where we choose the state. You can choose a state from the drop-down or just type it into the box. So today, let's look at Indiana. Next, we'll click Begin Analysis, and you'll encounter a box that just warns you that when you change your state, you'll be overwriting all of the data that you've been working on so far. Now, we don't really anticipate many users changing their states in the middle of a scenario, but it's important to note that if you were to change your state, all of the data would be lost. So we haven't made any changes yet, so it's totally fine for us to press OK here. So the first page in the preliminary input step are renewable energy characteristics. This page consists of two main windows. I'll talk about the left-hand one first. In this section, you can choose the gigawatt hours that you anticipate for your state in the different scenarios. You can take a look at what the 2012 baseline is, or you can choose between the 111D projection or the 111D alternate projection. You can also select a user input. Let's say you were doing a scenario where you thought there would be twice as many renewables as EPA set out in its proposed rule. You could just type in this number times 2 and fill it down for all the years. You can also just enter in data as you see fit. Today, though, let's just stick with the 111D default. The second window on the right is about more renewable characteristics. You can enter values for the share of this renewable generation by resource type. So for this scenario, let's say that 75% of our generation is coming from onshore wind, and 25% is coming from utility PV. You can also make changes to capacity factor. So for example, say you had a scenario where you thought you could get much better capacity factors from onshore wind. You could change this 26% number to something like 30%, or whatever you like. The next page is all about energy efficiency. Excuse me. This page is actually a lot like the renewable page we were just on, where you can enter in the gigawatt hour savings you anticipate from energy efficiency. You can enter in, or you can select from a menu of costs, and those are program administrator or utility costs for energy efficiency. Or you can select different values for your growth rate, that is load growth rate. You can choose between two different AEOs, 2013 and 2014, and you can choose between annual growth rates or cumulative average growth rates. At the bottom of this page, there's a couple of paragraphs that I want to highlight. A number of users have told us that when they're thinking about energy efficiency, often they're thinking about it more in terms of savings as a percent of sales in each year as opposed to sheer savings. And while that capability currently doesn't exist within CP3T, I've written up a walkthrough in our user manual in Appendix B about how to translate savings as a percent of sales into cumulative gigawatt hours. So again, just one more plug for how useful I think the user manual is and how much I encourage people to use it whenever possible. On the next page, you can make adjustments to non-111D generation. So that's new capacity additions for NGCs units or NGCs units, or changes to imports and net exports. So for example, if you thought your net imports were going to increase in future years, you could change it to user input and say it would be the 2012 level plus, let's say, 200 gigawatt hours. For now, let's just use the default. On this page, you can set your displacement order. There's a couple of important points I want to mention about this. When users are setting up their displacement order, they should pick an order that makes sense given either current economic dispatch or future economic dispatch in their state. So if you had a state where currently existing NGCs were on the margin, you would want those to be selected first. So they would be the first type of resource to get displaced by any new generation, whether that's new 111B generation or new renewables and energy efficiency. And then you have to make some changes to make sure that each resource was only selected once. An alternate thing you could do is set up a system in which resources are displaced according to future economic dispatch. For example, if you had a carbon price in effect, that would cause coal units to be the units that would be displaced first. You can set that up. The next page deals with the CO2 price. And there's a few important distinctions here about why this is a little bit different than the previous page. While setting the displacement order actually changes how the model calculates displacement on a fundamental level. The CO2 price is included just to represent CO2 prices from a cost perspective. Now, there are a couple of different ways to think about CO2 prices. Oftentimes, CO2 prices are thought to be implemented where there would actually be no real cost to the system and no real cost to ratepayers. And the outcome of a CO2 price would be just to change the displacement order that we altered on that previous page. And if that were the case, you would pick none. However, if you wanted to analyze a CO2 price that actually was a real electric system cost and impacted ratepayers in a real sense, you could choose one of the Synapse costs that we've got here, or choose from the user input. So here we are on the Calibrate scenario page. And like I said, we've got 4 different variables to check. The first is annual peak demand in terms of megawatt capacity by year. The second is annual generation. The third is emissions rate and whether or not you're meeting the 111D target. And the fourth is emissions and whether or not you're meeting the 11D target from a mass-based perspective. And this fourth variable actually includes 2 different comparisons against the more lenient target and the more stringent target set out by EPA. For each of these variables, you can see whether or not you're meeting the requirement in each year, and if you're not, the degree to which you're off of the target. So we're not meeting the target for generation, for emissions rate, or emissions, but we're doing okay for annual peak demand. That means that we're going to have to go back and make some changes to preliminary inputs or to the unit-specific data. But before I do that, I want to highlight these output buttons over here, where you can take a look at your outputs in terms of tables and your outputs in terms of charts. And I think clicking this charts button is really helpful whenever you get to this calibration page, whether you're fully calibrated or not. And I'll tell you why here. This page really gives you an idea of just how much you're meeting the requirements or not meeting the requirements. So like I said, you're meeting the requirements for capacity under this scenario. You're really long in every single year on capacity, so you should be all set. For generation, there's just a small gap in some of the early years that we're going to have to make up. The next chart is about all statewide generation, including imports. And the fourth one is about emissions rate. And you can see the gap that stands to be made up by whatever it is we'll have, whatever changes we make to this to our scenario next. The fifth chart looks at the emissions requirement from a mass-based perspective. And this is different from the above chart in that it only includes generation types that are relevant to 111D. And the final chart is about annual system costs. So let's go back to the Calibrate page and make some changes. First, let's look at the unit-specific data. So this page lists every single fossil unit and nuclear unit within this state. It lists information about the unit type, the unit name, the 2012 baseline, so that's the capacity factor, emissions rate, et cetera. On this page, you can enter things about when you, or enter inputs about when you think the unit is going to retire. So let's say this one's going to retire in 2015. You just enter that in. You can scroll over and make changes to capacity. You can scroll further over and make changes to capacity factor. So for example, if you thought this unit was going to increase its capacity factor in the future up to 30%, you can make that change in each year you think it's going to apply. And then you can make changes to emission rates. So in addition to making these changes by hand, we've set up a number of default buttons up here that you can click. The first button you can click applies an emissions rate adjustment to all of your coal units. And this emulates the EPA's Building Block 1, where every single coal unit gets an emissions rate improvement of 6% starting in 2020. So let's click that. And you can see here that the emissions rate improvement has filled in starting in 2020 for every single coal unit. We can also apply a single capacity factor to NGCs units. So applying a 70% capacity factor approximates the EPA's Building Block 2. Let's apply that as well. Finally, I happen to have here a list of coal unit retirements in Indiana. If you had such a list, you could apply this yourself. So I'm just going to paste these in. And now all of these coal units are retiring in the year stated according to EIA data and Synapse's own research. So let's go back to calibration and see how all these changes impacted our scenario. So peak demand is still being met in every single year. We're not meeting annual generation in many years, presumably because we're retiring a lot of coal plants. We're now meeting the emissions rate in every single year, and we're meeting both emissions targets in 2020 and 2021, and meeting the more stringent, the less stringent target in 2022 through 2030. Let's take a look at what that means from a charts perspective. So now we see this big gap in generation that we're going to need to make up in some way. We see how we're just barely meeting the emissions rate in each year. And from an emissions perspective, total emissions are well below the EPA targets for this state. Let's make a few more changes. So going to the non-111D generation page, we can add in some new NGCs. According to EIA 860, there's a proposed NGCC coming online in 2016 of 670 megawatts. So let's put that in place, put it through the entire study period, and go back to the calibration page and see how that changed. So again, we're meeting the emissions rate still. The emissions requirement is also still being met, but we've still got a gap in generation. Now, as you can imagine, building out a scenario requires a large number of iterations and a lot of thinking about the sort of changes that you're applying to the system and how those affect your system, not just from an emissions perspective, but also from a generation of peak demand perspective. So in the interest of time, let's just say that we're going to meet the remaining generation through increased imports. So I'm just going to copy the rest of this generation, go back to the non-111D generation and imports page, drop it in here just as a placeholder, change our level of imports to user input, and just type in a little formula that says the new set of imports is going to be the 2012 baseline plus whatever increment we need. Now, going back to the calibration page, we see that we're meeting annual generation every single year. And taking a look at charts, now that gap that we saw is being met by both imports and that new NGCC we added. And again, the emissions rate and the emissions target are both being met. There's a few more things that I want to go through in this walkthrough, and both of them have to deal with the back end of the model. The first is this button that says References Core Model, and the second is the References Background Model Inputs button. Clicking the Core Model button brings us to the internal guts of the model. And on this page, we can see a series of tables that look at the different variables that we're analyzing in CP3T. First is capacity, then demand, sales, the scenario displacements algorithm, generation, emission, capacity factors, and as we scroll down, you can see emissions, emission rates, levelized costs, and costs. Again, I want to highlight the fact that CP3T is an open source model where we're encouraging you to make edits where you think the tool might need a change or might need to change for the particular scenario you're working in. And in those situations, you can just go right ahead and make edits to the formulas here themselves. Also on the right-hand side, there's a notes column which often highlights the formulas that are embedded in each one of these cells and can help you understand exactly how CP3T works in case you want to get down into the details of the model itself. The second button brings you to a background model inputs page. And there's a large number of tables on here. I think there's something like 21 or 22. And I'm not going to go through them all, but I want to highlight that they contain everything from just system constants to non-fuel costs for fossil and nuclear units to our renewable energy assumptions. So you might be interested in understanding the actual capacity that you're getting from each resource type in renewables. Remember at the beginning I entered a renewable generation trajectory and then said 75% of that is coming from wind and established that there is some capacity factor associated with that wind. That means that the model is calculating what the actual capacity requirement for wind would be in this scenario. And you can scroll through this reference tables sheet here down at the bottom and find out what that means and whether that makes sense or is obtainable within your particular scenario. So going back to the PowerPoint, I want to talk a little here about next steps. All of these points are features that we're looking forward to implementing in a new version of the model. We want to make changes to the model in terms of upgrades to usability, model calibration, and model navigation. We want to add in capability for multi-state compliance, which is something that the tool currently does not do. We'd like to make a few changes to the dispatch algorithm and make that more sophisticated, as well as integrate known historical and anticipated fossil unit retirements. We'd like to add in the capability to analyze U.S. tribes and territories and add in unit-level fuel switching. So, for example, that would be to turn coal units into NGCs, things like that. Or rather, natural gas power, not necessarily NGCs. We've also thought about adding in toggles to analyze the effect of changing the way that nuclear generation is handled for the purposes of 111D, and adding in suggested pathways for compliance. So these would be sort of like default scenarios that figure out the least cost option on its own. So the version of CP3T I walked through today was developed with support from Sierra Club, the Economics, Environment, and Society Institute, and Synapse. But we're looking for funding to make the updates that I just walked through here and apply CP3T both in its current form and future forms to understanding Clean Power Plan compliance. So please contact us if you're interested in doing so, and you can do that at cp3t@synapse-energy.com. So this brings me to the end of the webinar, and I'd like to thank everyone for listening. And again, just highlight questions. If you have any questions about CP3T or the webinar I've given, please submit your questions through the webinar comments. If you think of any questions after the webinar ends, please email cp3t@synapse-energy.com. And again, we won't be responding to any questions today, but we'll be responding to you either individually through an email with a published FAQ or with another webinar. I'll be leaving the webinar running for the next 5 minutes or so. So if you'd like to type in any questions into the comment box, please use this time to do so. Otherwise, once you close the webinar, you'll immediately get a link to a survey, which we really appreciate you filling out, both to assist us in giving better webinars in the future and to help us understand what you think about CP3T and what you might want to use CP3T for in the future. So thank you, and we look forward to you using our tool.